This is a video. In this video, we're gonna talk about programming for strength, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced. And I'm gonna try to give you my best perspective, breaking down a whole bunch of very, very nuanced and deep information into something that is hopefully relatively digestible, whether you program for yourself or whether you're just trying to understand what your coach does better. If you want to get strong, here's how you do it. Before we get into this discussion, I want to lay out some ground rules. This is going to be in regards to the assumptions we're making when it comes to what is beginner, intermediate, and advanced. So let's define these terms, and then we'll get into it. Firstly, I think it's important that we look at least two metrics here, because I don't think either training age or ability to progress are sufficient on their own. We're gonna have outliers in either case that break those rules, but if we use them in conjunction, we might be able to get a decent definition here. So let's start with beginner. Now, this is somebody, for the sake of training age, who is from 0 to maybe 2 years into their journey. And in terms of rate of progression, we're looking at somebody who can make progress reliably every week, if not every session. For our intermediate lifters, we're looking at somebody from, let's say, 2 to 5 years of training age, and someone for whom the week-to-week gains have slowed down. This lifter's probably looking at trying to make progress block over block, potentially seeing some plateaus. And finally, our advanced lifter. Now, we could also break down advanced into subsections, but we're not going to do that here. We're looking for somebody who has probably at least 5 years of training history and somebody for whom we've seen potentially a number of plateaus. The gains are harder to come by. Maybe we only get one lift progressing at a time and we're fighting harder and clawing for every inch of those gains. Now that we've defined our categories, let's get into the differences in programming for each of these different kinds of lifter. This is still a video. Programming for beginners. Now, unfortunately and fortunately in this category, pretty much everything works. So instead of going over the most general guidelines that anyone has ever heard for strength training, I'm instead going to try to pick out a couple of the things that I think would be optimal and take a step further towards optimization for the beginner category. The first element of programming that I'm going to talk about for each of these categories is frequency. When we're talking about frequency for a beginner, we generally want to bump it up a little bit, and we can afford to do most things more than once a week, because one of the things a beginner needs is repetition. They need practice. They need to develop the skill of executing these movements. For the squat, it's generally a pretty intuitive movement, but I still think most beginners could afford to squat twice a week just because they'll adapt pretty quickly. For the bench press, I would say maybe 3 times a week, because the bench is such an unintuitive movement. Unless you've done bench press before because you played football in high school or whatever, it's worth getting that extra little bit of practice in to make sure we build that skill faster. It takes a lot of reps. Now for deadlift, it can be one of the more fatiguing movements for the lower body. It does tend to be a little bit more intuitive. I think on the deadlift, 1 time a week is fine, potentially 2. The second aspect I want to cover is intensity. As a beginner, you need some intensity, but also pretty much anything is intensity for a beginner, especially if your previous intensity was chilling playing World of Warcraft. If you're a beginner, I would worry a lot less about what specifically you need on the bar, whether it's 78.5 or 79%. I would work towards something like leave a rep or 2 in the tank. It's worth it at this point to start dabbling with what's called RPE, rate of perceived exertion. Tons of information and resources on that out there. We're not going to get super into it here, but learning to understand how to rate your intensity and what intensity feels like is the big goal here. For most of your main lifts, leave 2 to 3 reps in the tank. Over time, learn to equate that to about 7 to 8 RPE, and we're good. Another thing worth mentioning when it comes to beginners and gauging intensity is that most beginners don't actually know what a 10 RPE feels like. They don't know what it's like to go all the way to failure. A lot of times a beginner will say, yeah, I only had 2 reps left. But if you give them that same weight again and say, okay, do as many as possible, they'll do 4 more reps or 5 more reps. So for this reason, in certain instances, I do think that there's value in prescribing an AMRAP for a beginner lifter. When it comes to exercise selection for beginner programming, get the fundamentals down. Use the basic big bang for your buck movements. We want to squat, we want to bench press, we want to deadlift, we want to overhead press, and probably do some kind of row. Those are the big rocks that fill up the most space. You put those in the jar first. Step 3, profit. For beginners, I would usually keep exercises relatively specific. I wouldn't use too many variations. I don't think we need bands and chains and board presses for beginner lifters. I do think there's some value in tempo variations and maybe some pause variations. Keep it simple here. Try to nail down the fundamentals. And lastly, when it comes to progression and structure within programming, what I would recommend for a beginner lifter is keep it open, keep it loose, keep it fluid. For a beginner lifter, again, because we don't necessarily know how to modulate our intensity at this point, you could easily find progress on a lift. Maybe you're doing, 3 sets of 5. You could progress on that lift for 8 or 9 weeks in a row before you hit the wall with too much fatigue and start feeling beat up, or run out of room to progress. And I think when we're a beginner lifter, we want to allow these progressions to take as long as they need to. In terms of planning for that progression, like I said, the example where we're doing a 3x5. Do 3x5 until we get up to a 9 RPE and then claw back a rep. Go to 3x4. Start your progression over again. Progress up until we hit 9.5 RPE. As soon as you start feeling really fatigued and beat up, that's where you put in a deload week. It doesn't need to be much more complicated than that. You can take it week by week and say, I felt good, I've got more room, let's keep going. Chances are you'll mess that up a few times. You might think you've got more room, or you can keep going and then go in and hit the wall and miss a rep. When you're a beginner, these things are gonna happen. It's not a big deal. Brush it off, take your deload week if you need it, get back on the horse. So for each tier or subsection of programming, the beginner, intermediate, and advanced, I want to go through a little bit of a checklist of what we're trying to achieve throughout this phase. Now, through the beginner phase of your programming, what you're trying to achieve is, number one, we want to develop some familiarity and some understanding with RPE so that we can begin to rate RPE and understand intensity and know how far we are from failure. Number two, we want to try to develop a base level of work capacity. We want to be pushing what we're capable of doing in terms of work and training so that we can build upon that in future phases. And number three, we want to build some competency within the movements. Get enough reps and have enough practice that we can do a consistent looking squat, bench press, and deadlift. Once you got those locked away, then we're looking at intermediate programming. And now getting into intermediate programming for strength. Frequency-wise, this is going to be the place where I think, generally speaking, just a rote increase in frequency across the board. You might want to make that third. If you're squatting twice a week, you can go to 3. You might want to make that less specific variation, something like a split squat or a leg press or something like that. I've also had a lot of success using a high rep, low RPE, high bar squat, and things like that. In terms of the bench press, this is a place where you can get up to 4, 5, or maybe even 6 bench exposures per week. Again, because the bench is so counterintuitive as a movement, as a pattern, a lot of the times frequency and just practice is massive in terms of making bench progress. And for the deadlift, a lot of times this is where we're gonna slot in a second deadlift slot. Usually a variation, perhaps an alternate stance. If you're sumo, pull conventional. If you're conventional, pull sumo. But in any case, getting a second exposure of deadlift in there, I think is a good idea at this point. Moving on to intensity. Now, by this point, we should have at least a bit of a grasp on RPE. And at this point, as we're increasing the frequency, what comes with that should be learning to better modulate where that intensity is placed. In the example of running 4 times per week bench frequency, here's an idea of what I'd aim for. We would have one exposure that is relatively specific and pretty high intensity. We'd have another exposure, our second exposure would be relatively low intensity. The third exposure would be a sort of moderate to high intensity. And the final exposure, again, would be somewhat low intensity. By modulating your intensity correctly, You're gonna allow yourself to increase that frequency without running into too many issues. Another key component of intermediate programming and intensity is gonna be starting to lean on auto-regulation. Right? Now that we understand the RPEs, we want to be able to use them, even if infrequently, to adjust what we're doing in a given day. If we're feeling a little better, we put a little more on. If we're feeling a little worse, we take a little bit off the bar. Starting to lean on those kinds of things can allow you to take advantage of good days and bad days and ensure that our recovery is matching what we're asking of the system. In terms of exercise selection, this is a point where things start to open up a little bit. By this level, lifters should have a pretty consistent pattern on their lift. And within that consistent pattern, there will probably be somewhat easy to identify issues. Maybe somebody has a poor bench bar path. Maybe somebody has a hard time keeping their knees forward and staying in their quads on the squat. In any case, this is the point where we'll be able to intelligently and intentionally target these patterns with developmental exercises. And what I mean by that is, let's go back to the examples I used. Issues with the bar path on the bench. We just did a video about it. Pin press, great way to target that. We have a lifter who is struggling to keep their knees forward and stay, in decent position. They're doing the squat morning in their squat. Pause squats and pin squats, great movements there. So around this point, in terms of exercise selection, what we're looking to do is supplement and build up those main patterns with developmental movements that target the deficiencies in those patterns. So now that we have consistent patterns, we have consistent flaws, we can aim exercises at them intelligently. Whereas maybe a beginner, patterns are kind of all over the place. We don't know what our weaknesses are yet. In this phase, we should be able to come up with good answers for most of that stuff. Now we're going to get into progression and structure within this level of programming. So at this point, we're probably not making progress every single session or maybe even week to week. What we're going to start to look at and lean on in terms of our metrics that will tell us whether or not we're making progress is going to probably be our estimated 1 rep max, and we're looking to try to have that go up block over block. This is why it's really important at this point to have a system. At this point, we should be starting to put together a system and a way of comparing blocks, looking at the data and saying, okay, we achieved this E1RM on the squat here at the end of block 1 and this E1RM on the squat at the end of block 2. What's different? What lens are we looking at that through? How are we going to decide what made one block successful or not successful when compared to another? This is the system I'm talking about. You're going to need to understand what you're looking at, how to compare these across blocks, and then start to get a handle on what levers you can pull and dials you can push in different directions to try to make these changes. What adjustments can you make if a block goes poorly? What are you going to recreate if a block goes really well? In my own system of programming, for example, I change very little week to week. Within a block, most, if not all of the parameters for every exercise stay the same. This allows me to look back at a block and more reliably say, okay, we did ramping sets of 4 on the squat, we had leg press 10s, and then we did pin squat doubles. What about that is different from this other block where it went better or worse? That allows me to change one thing at a time and employ a bit more of a scientific process of elimination and experimentation when it comes to changing training for the lifter. Now again, I'm just going to continue speaking to my own sort of structure of training, but the repeating week structure that I use allows me to then start zooming out, because what happens is after a certain number of weeks of repeating the same protocol, a lifter will reach a peak state and their performance will start to deteriorate. This is something we call time to peak, better known as how long a block should take. The other thing this repeating week structure allows us to do is to start to break things up more concretely into blocks. After a certain number of weeks of the same protocol, a lifter will not be able to progress on that protocol anymore. The block has run its course. Let's say that's 4 weeks, 5 weeks. That's how long a block takes for that lifter. Somewhat individual, and it's gonna allow us to zoom out a little bit, start to plan training a little further out with a bit more of a big picture, but we're starting from the bottom and we're zooming out. To conclude that section, we want to have another checklist of the things that we've been working towards as an intermediate lifter. Number one, we want to have a better handle on gauging our intensity, as well as we probably want to start leaning a little bit on auto-regulation. We want to be able to start using that intensity information to gauge our performance on any given day and therefore have better training on any given day. Number two, we want to start tolerating a little bit of a higher frequency. We want to bring our ability to do work and to do more work up slightly from when we were a beginner. Number three, we want to identify problems or issues in our movement patterns. Throughout our main lifts, we want to be able to diagnose what might be going wrong, turn around and prescribe targeted exercises to help bring those up. And finally, we want to determine block length and develop a dynamic system that we can use to make smart and intentional programming decisions based on the data that we're collecting. Most coaches use different systems or slight variations of systems. I don't think any one is right or wrong, but whatever system you use, you need to start learning it and developing it, understanding the boundaries of it, understanding how that's going to color how you look at training and look at programming and the results that you're seeing. With all that, let's get into the easiest stuff, programming for advanced lifters. All right, so you know when I said that programming for advanced lifters was the easiest part? Well, I lied. Of course I lied, Phil. It's poker. Insert meme here.
Oh, you lied.
Of course I lied. It's poker, Phil.
The first thing to know about programming for advanced lifters is that the need for individualization within programming becomes front and center. We need to have, again, that system I talked about. We need to be able to pull out what works and what doesn't and understand what we're trying to use to drive each lift. Different lifters are going to need different things, and even for the same lifter, a different lift might need a different protocol. Somebody's bench protocol is definitely not going to work for their deadlift protocol, and that might still be different yet from what they need for their squat, despite the squat and deadlift both being lower body lifts. Talking once more about frequency. We're going to want to try to increase frequency. The basic principle of progressive overload would state that we need to do more than we've done before to get further than where we're at. However, at this point in an athlete's career, it becomes even more important that we differentiate more specific and less specific exposures. We're going to find out over time that there are bottlenecks in terms of how much stress per pattern a lifter can tolerate. For example, in the squat, it might be the shoulders, it might be the back, it might be the knees. In these instances, we want to be able to get around those while still increasing the frequency to increase the volume by utilizing something like a safety squat bar so that we can get away from pissing the shoulders off, or a leg press to take some stress off the back, or I don't know how you train your squat without your knees, but I've been trying. When it comes to intensity, again, it depends, right? The best worst answer ever. You may find that per lifter per lift, you need high intensity and an overall low amount of volume. Or maybe you can't really go above a 6 or 7 RPE, but you can slam submaximal volume all day long. Knowing these key differences, again, per lifter per lift, is the key to further individualizing things and understanding what sort of intensity when a lifter needs. Getting into exercise selection, all bets are off. At this point, I will entertain and reach for exercises that I wouldn't otherwise. I might investigate how well a block pull works for an advanced lifter's deadlift, whereas for a beginner, I would absolutely not recommend block pulls. Same thing with a board press or touch and go deadlifts is one that I've been using not infrequently with a few of my more advanced lifters. Definitely not something I would recommend for a beginner lifter. These are things that we're trying to explore as further and further alternatives. Once we get to this point in being an advanced lifter, our programming sort of horizons and the pool of exercises that we're pulling from just widens and widens and widens. I think you can get away with a lot less specific things because those advanced lifters are going to be so well trained in their competition lift that if you can build strength or provide stimulus in a pretty non-specific and seemingly unconnected way, in some cases, that's exactly what's needed to drive that other quality. In terms of progression and structure, by this point, we should pretty much have mastered our system, or at least approached mastery. We should know exactly how to look at a block and determine whether or not we got the result we were trying to achieve. We should be able to look at a block and understand, at least with some degree of confidence, what was different from a previous block in that block, how we can apply those changes as a new rule set moving forward with the lifter. Again, going back to some of my previous points, understanding where and when we need the intensity, understanding what kind of frequency this lifter can tolerate. You need to take that and start to understand trying to achieve seemingly less relevant goals in certain blocks. For example, you might have a block where you're trying to push work capacity. Now, you know that your lifter's gonna get a little extra beat up. You know that probably the numbers are not gonna look great. We might see deflated E1RMs. We might see, again, higher fatigue scores and things like that. Our goal is that we can transition this increased work capacity into further results in the next block or 2 blocks down the road. Understanding the push and pull of ordering blocks, how one feeds into another, the constraints of each block based on the lifter's response previously to similar protocols. This mastery of your system, again, is not a binary thing. I don't think you ever achieve it. You don't ever become perfect and check mark, you're done learning. But at some point you get to a place of being very comfortable within your system, and you're able to look at these variables, draw conclusions, make changes, and go through this process of educated trial and error in order to try to advance an already advanced lifter. That is what's going to lead you to truly individualized programming that is tailored and catered specifically to one individual, further breaking that down into that individual's individual lifts. And there you have it. Super straightforward, super easy. One simple trick. All you need, take it and run. You have all of the experience of 11 years of practiced coaching. And if anything in this video made you think, hey, maybe I could use a coach. Maybe I'd like to do some programming that this guy with the tattoos on his head wrote. Well, you can head to calgarybarbell.com. I am a coach. I've been for years, if that wasn't clear. I also have a team of 3 other beautiful, wonderful, amazing, world-class coaches who have been making people stronger for many, many years at this point. And if that doesn't float your boat, we also do nutrition coaching, and we have the Calgary Barbell training app, wherein you get access to over 50 programs that I wrote using all of these systems and philosophies, as well as weekly check-ins with myself and a couple of other Calgary Barbell coaches, and access to our app-exclusive Discord so that we can help you learn a lot of the stuff that we talked about in this video. Using an app, you don't necessarily have somebody to ask, hey, why did you make this coaching decision? How can I tailor this to what works best for me? How can I merge these 2 programs? But in the Calgary Barbell app Discord, you can do that because I'm in there answering questions. We have a bunch of very experienced community members answering questions. And like I said, we do check-ins every week. If that's something that interests you, check it out. Want to thank everybody for watching this video. We got some apparel for sale that just went up last weekend. And yeah, we appreciate you all. Like and subscribe. Peace out.